So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Bill Taylor. I'm one of the vice presidents here at the United States Institute of Peace, and we're very pleased to welcome you here to the Institute. If you haven't been here before, we'd be glad to show you around, and we're very proud of the building. It allows us to pull people like you in for these kinds of discussions, and we hope that the environment is conducive to these kind of policy and program and regional discussions. I think this is a great one that we're here for. The Institute for Peace and War Reporting. Did I get this right here? War and Peace. War and Peace.
At
the Institute of Peace, we say peace and war. However, so we can do it that way. You can choose your names on this thing. And we choose ours. So we're very pleased that we're teaming up on this discussion here today. It's an important one. The Institute of Peace has done some work on this, and you will hear the kind of work that we've done back here on this. And then you'll also hear about how this applies to and how it's being put into practice in Iraq and Syria. As we're talking about. So this, I think, will be a very good conversation. Look forward to your participation. I'm very pleased that the Associate Vice President here at the Institute of Peace, Manal Omar, many of you know, will be moderating this discussion here today. Manal has great experience in all of the region that we're talking about here. She also has taught me everything I know about this region. She knows more than that, and it's great to have her as the moderator for this thing. You are in very good hands, and she has more information coming from Aubrey, with whom we will also thank for the work that they've done. So. Without anything further, let me hand this to Manal, and I look forward to this discussion. Thank you very much for joining us here.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. And I just want to echo Ambassador Taylor in welcoming our panelists and also the topic. You know, whenever I travel in the region, there's a lot of passion centered around the role of media. There's a real strong acknowledgement that particularly social media, which is harder to control by the state, has open channels, but there's also a fear in terms of the agendas that may be owned by either state or private sector. So I think that this conversation and the fact that it's really rooted in people who are based in the field is going to be an exciting one. We're very eager for it to be a conversation. So, you know, all the panelists have asked not to make it any formal type of discussion, but really to open up and to hear where your interests are. So we will be, you know, following that format of really listening to what the primary questions are, and then again rooting it in terms of what is the reality and what are the gaps in the field. I will introduce the panelists, very quickly. I think my role of moderator is to speak as little as possible and to give as much to them as the floor. We have the opportunity for interaction through questions, so there'll be papers circulated. As you think of questions, please write them down and pass them on. Again, we'll be asking them throughout the session. We also have a hashtag for those who are watching on webcast or anyone who wants to tweet, which is #conflictreporting. So I know I personally always love the Twitter feedback in terms of live interaction and maybe doing it myself. So please feel free to put your thoughts out, and then also questions we'll be accepting via Twitter and the webcast. So we'll start with Anand Verghese, who's a program officer at the Institute of Peace, working on the PeaceTech initiatives. And Anand will give us some, the statistics and the highlights of the data in terms of the work that USIP has been doing in media. We'll move on to Susan Fisher, who's the regional program manager for the Middle East with the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, and she's based in Beirut and will be able to give us real insight in terms of what she's been seeing on the ground and also working on the Syria conflict. And then we'll turn to Ahmad Shabandar, who's the Chief of Mission for the Institute of War and Peace Reporting in Iraq. So as you can see, a very live panel, and I'll turn it straight to you, Anand, to start us off.
I'm going to jump to the laptop and ask you all to crane your heads a little bit, since my presentation is going to be up on the screen. Thanks, Manal, and thank you, Susanna and Amar. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Anand Verghese. I work at the PeaceTech initiative here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I'm going to talk to you really not as a Middle East expert, but as somebody who's very interested in the effects of social media the transitions that we're seeing due to social media on the ground in places like Syria and Iraq, and really around the world in the places that we work as an institute. And the Blogs and Bullets project is our initiative that looks deeply at this issue. Before I dive into it, I wanted to give you a bit of context about the PeaceTech initiative itself. We were started about 5 years ago at the Institute, really because of this fact, that peace building, like so many other fields, like journalism, like business, is undergoing a fundamental shift because of technologies, because of media. And that shift is happening because of a simple but profound change that takes people in conflict zones, you and I, and makes us all media makers. And not just media makers for our friends and family, but media makers for a global audience. And this, we think, is just the beginning. What you're seeing here is now, I think, a somewhat outdated map. It's a map of Facebook connections around the world at a time when 1 in 9 people had a Facebook account. The statistic is closer to 1 in 6 or 7 right now. And what this means is that conflict zones that used to be shrouded by fogs of war are really becoming data-rich environments. We're getting audio, video, images, and a ton of data, often that's being generated by the victims of conflict themselves, by the people who are experiencing it on a day-to-day. And so the Blogs and Bullets project and the PeaceTech initiative in general asks, how can we harness this more purposefully? How can we take this and make it part of the Peace Builders toolkit? So Blogs and Bullets specifically looks at how new media is affecting conflict and social change. What is the causal role of social media and technologies in the kind of political upheavals we've seen around the world? And we've taken 3 sort of broad approaches to answering this question, which I'm going to break down for you right now. The first is an analytical framework, a nuanced analytical framework. What does that mean? Some of you may recall in 2009 when the Iranian elections happened and the so-called Twitter revolution broke out. It also started a really robust and somewhat divisive debate amongst policymakers, amongst academics, about the role of social media in social change and political upheaval around the world. And it broke down into 2 camps. One camp, the cyber optimists, who thought that these new technologies were really opening up amazing avenues for activists and political liberals around the world to create positive change. Another camp came back, the cyber skeptics, as we call them, said, no, these avenues are just new arenas where regimes and bad actors are having even greater influence. Part of our thinking was that surely there are more than just 2 ways to describe this phenomenon. And this is where our 5-level analytical framework that I'm going to describe to you comes up. We said, instead of thinking about, is the internet good, is the internet bad for social change, what kind of effects are the internet and new media and technologies having at the individual level? How are individual activists and citizens able to engage in topics, gain new knowledge that they weren't able to before? At the collective action level, how are these individuals and activists then, with the power of technology, are they empowered to break collective action problems, to organize protests, to mobilize citizens and activists where they wouldn't have been able to before? At the 3rd level, are new media and technology really building intergroup relations the way we had hoped when the internet was beginning to grow? There was a lot of enthusiasm around its role in breaking down cultural and geographic and political borders. Oddly enough, there was similar enthusiasm around radio and TV and print when those revolutions happened as well. But to what extent are these technologies building bridges that didn't exist before? And at the 4th level, how are regimes reacting to all these phenomena? Are regimes clamping down on technology and activism around that's empowered by technology? Are they co-opting it? Are they left ham-handed and really unable to do anything, or are they letting it go? And finally, how are technologies, new media and technology, affecting external attention to the places where Susanna and Amar and Manal live and work every day, and all of our peace builders around the world? Are we confusing our attention on Twitter and Facebook for actual change on the ground? And so this analytical framework really begins to reframe, hopefully, the way we have this discussion around technology and its role. The second piece of the Blogs and Bullets project has been really to take a step back from the day-to-day anecdotes that we might see on the role of technology. I had a professor who once said, the plural of anecdote is not data. And the idea is to take all of the vast amounts of data that are coming out of social media and really begin to use the new data analysis tools and visualizations tools, one of which you're seeing here today was developed by a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Morningside Analytics. This was created in 2009. It's a visualization of really thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Arabic language blogs. And these kinds of tools, along with the data that social media is generating and this analytical framework, are giving us a ton of new insights. And the third prong of our research is to really engage the private sector. If data is our fodder, it is the bread and butter of these companies. Twitter and Google and Facebook make their entire businesses on the data that we hope to analyze. So engaging them as partners in this project has really been a key part of our approach. I'm going to sort of delve a little bit more deeply into some research that is a bit more specific to the Middle East and the region that we're going to discuss in detail. As I said, I'm not a Middle East expert, but we did have all of this research done by friends and partners at the George Washington University, all of whom are very deeply ensconced in the Middle East realities. And I wanted to speak about a couple of the reports and a few of the sort of interesting findings that these reports generated, and perhaps sort of start a discussion that then we can continue through the rest of the panel. The first report was published in July of 2012, and it was a research based on Twitter data that came out of the Arab Spring. So it looked at Twitter discussions around Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, and Libya around between January and April of 2011. It actually analyzed about 45,000 links and the consumption of Twitter information around the world and in the region and in these countries themselves. And what we found, one of the interesting findings of this report was that during the Arab Spring, online social networks' most important role really wasn't about informing local audiences about protests and other events. Experts found much stronger evidence that new media informs international audiences and mainstream media reporting, and not really playing a role in local events. So when hundreds of thousands of people came on the street in Egypt, they probably did it by looking out the window or watching Al Jazeera, not because of Twitter and Facebook. This graph shows researchers sourced the location of where people clicked on Twitter links that had to do with each of these countries during the Arab Spring, and found that the majority, at times the vast majority, of clicks came from outside the country and really even outside the region. So this goes to the point that I was speaking about, that often these tools are informing external audiences, perhaps us here in DC, but not so much local realities. The second report that I want to discuss was published a little bit more recently, and it was around the Syrian crisis that is ongoing. It was published in January of 2014. It too looked at Syrian Twitter data around the hashtag Syria. It was data that was culled over the course of around 2 years, from January of 2011 to April of 2013. It analyzed 38 million tweets. And I wanted to talk about a couple of graphs that illustrate the interaction between new media and old media, as it were, more conventional media sources. This graph here talks about, talks about the fact that Twitter and mainstream media attention to Syria were really highly correlated. So what you're seeing up there is Arabic and English, blue and red, the Twitter discussions, and down in the green is the news media discussions. You'll see that the peaks of the Twitter discussions really follow the peaks of the news discussions and vice versa. So there's really not much to support the claim that social media played sort of an inordinate amount of attention to Syria, and that the regular media were ignoring it. Quite the opposite. The second graph, and perhaps the last graph I'll show today before I sort of give up the the podium, was about the discussion in Arabic and English around the Syrian conflict. And you'll see at the beginning of the study in January, really English and Arabic were equally playing into the discourse around the Syrian conflict. But as the conflict progressed, it really became, there was an unmistakable shift from English to Arabic as the dominant language of online discourse. Not only that, there was a substantive sort of variation in the topics that were discussed. Researchers analyzed, for example, the use of the word Obama in the tweets across the course of this study. And Obama was quite prevalent in English discussions, but really wasn't present in the Arabic discussions. Perhaps only at the time when there was a threat of a major threat of American intervention, Obama seemed to come up in the Twitter discussions, but really he only was a figure in the English language discussion on Twitter around the Syrian revolution. So this sort of illustrates a couple of interesting things about what we can learn from Twitter, what we can learn from large-scale data sets, and perhaps I give it now to my colleagues to ground this in the realities that they're facing every day.
It's wonderful. Thank you, Anand. You gave us a lot to think about, and in particular, I thought it was very helpful to give us some of the options to really understand so that we're not, kind of stuck between these cyber optimists or cyber skeptics. And I know that I sit and debate myself a lot in terms of media, and that was really helpful for us to really take into consideration. I want to turn over to Suzanne and Amar, and one of the questions that I wanted to start with is in terms of what really resonated listening to Anand and your personal experiences. And then one thing that really struck me as crucial for MENA is the question of how the regime reacts. And in terms of Tunisia and Egypt and Libya, the dictators really went into a reactionary mode. But with Syria and with Iraq, there was a head start for them to understand that social media is playing an important role. And I'd be interested to see if you saw reactions in terms of the regime, both in Syria and Iraq. But we'll start with you, Susan.
For me, one of the most important phrases from your presentation was right at the beginning when you spoke about transformation because of technology. And I think this is something I've really experienced in the field, because when I started with IWPR actually in 2005, I started to train journalists in Iraq, and at that time there were no citizen journalists on the ground. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook. I mean, it existed, but the majority of the people had not embraced it, and definitely not the media sector in Iraq. So it had no role whatsoever in the trainings we did in the beginning in Iraq, which was very different than when we started in Syria. But also in Syria, I could actually witness the change on the ground, because we started to train journalists in Syria, from Syria and in Syria in 2007, so way ahead of the Arab Spring. And at that time, we really had to handpick the people that we work with, because there were basically no independent journalists. There were no people who could report freely because the government restrictions were so strong, and we had to really find a network of people that we could trust in order to produce content that was out of line with the government-approved reporting. And this situation has changed so much. I mean, we had a small group of people that we could work with, and then when the Arab Spring started, there were these citizen journalists all of a sudden everywhere. They wanted training, they wanted professional skills, and all of a sudden there was reporters everywhere. And this is because of the technology they had at their disposal. They could use their cell phones, they could use Twitter, they could use Facebook, and this was a really interesting shift for us to witness, because all of a sudden you had so many sources, but this also brought problems with it, because you have so many. Before, I had a group of people that I trained and I worked with, and I knew I could trust them. Then all of a sudden now there's thousands of people report, and I have to pick, who can I trust? This person says in Hama this and this happened. How do I know it's true? How do I know that he is not trying to manipulate me? So with the transformation because of technology also comes more responsibility for the consumer of news, actually, that comes from these countries. And then the social media itself, for me, it has become kind of an extension of the battlefield. It's not neutral, and it's not a neutral platform where people can just post their stories, but it really, especially in the case of Syria, you can really see how the people on the ground at the opposite sides of the conflict use these platforms as part of their struggle. Like, they post stories, they defame people, they attack people, and Facebook has reacted to this also by shutting down websites, but this is really part of the conflict, and the media, because the topic is it helping the peace or is it fueling the conflict? I think now media really has both roles, and you have to watch very careful what you produce, where you put it, and how people consume the media. This I would just say quickly from my experience from the field.
That's very interesting, and I think particularly the role of the consumer. I mean, there's always been a certain role, but the fact that that really has shifted in terms of being able to filter what's actually factual and what's actually part of a larger agenda. Ammar?
Well, I guess the new media hasn't had a great impact in Iraq in comparison to other Middle Eastern countries for a number of reasons. Internet penetration in Iraq is still at the average of 7%, a little bit higher in urban centers, a little bit lower in rural areas. Maybe in Kurdistan region is a little bit higher than that. However, internet penetration has been an issue because Iraq has big issues with infrastructure, and aside from infrastructure, even in terms of licensing processes and so on, Iraq still hasn't managed to get the 3G networks running, while the rest of the world is running 4G. That's one aspect. The other aspect, I guess, is the issue of the generational gap. The majority of people who use new media tools, Facebook, Twitter, and other tools, are usually the younger generations, maybe people in their mid-20s and even younger than that. Obviously, their views, their worldview, their opinion about events in the country differ in comparison to the mainstream population. So during the 2011 and 2012 demonstrations, Facebook and social media was used as the main organizational vehicle or tool. But as a result, and the number of people who showed up for demonstrations, for example, at best never more than 2,000 at any one time. In terms of government reaction to social media, the Iraqi government doesn't have the tools to censor or monitor social media. So what they have done, they tried countering the anti-government or liberal activists online by creating parallel platforms that would speak on behalf of the government and the governmental institutions. So I would say so far, new media and internet has been a neutral battleground. It doesn't favor one side or the other. It really depends on each side's resources. And we've seen this in the election. The level of campaigning on Facebook during last month's election was huge. I mean, the majority of the fights were actually online between the liberal camp and the pro-government camp. And unfortunately, it was not reflected in the streets.
Okay. Great, thank you, Ammar. And that's actually very interesting to see that the campaigning did go online in terms of finding out what people were able to do. And the turnout with the Iraq elections was much higher than people anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, in comparison to the election last time, we anticipated to be around 25%. Opinion polls a month before the elections were rating it at 50 to 55%. And I think that would be an accurate reading of the situation. In some areas like Salah ad-Din and Misan, maybe above 60%. In Baghdad, around 52%. Roughly, now the final figures are not out yet, so these are guesstimates, informed estimations.
Yeah. Okay. I'm very curious that you both mentioned in terms of how that the social media isn't a neutral ground, and you know, it'd be very interested to hear the three panelists kind of expand a little bit more in terms of, you know, the cyber battles that do take place and how can they be controlled so that you aren't having them. I think someone was saying it's better that it's online and not on the street, or is it a different form of inciting violence? So it'd be interesting to kind of hear your take in terms of the role that this could play in terms of incitement or in terms of taking real debates online and having another way of expression.
Well, I think when it comes to Syria, the government takes the online field very seriously, and this is already shown by the fact that there's a thing called the Syrian Electronic Army, which really targets Syrian activists and journalists and try to infiltrate them through viruses, malware, etc. And we've had quite a lot of insight into this because we also run a digital security program in addition to our journalism program. So we've been really focusing on the digital threats that activists face, and you can really see that the the battle that's taking place on Facebook, for example, is a very serious one. And as you said, the government in Iraq doesn't have the capacity to monitor the activities online or to censor them online. Yeah, I don't think the Syrian government has the capacity still to censor it, but they definitely monitor it and they try to interfere. So there are Facebook pages that are actually just set up for the sake of attacking other people. Mohammed is nodding. I'm sure he can talk a lot about this experience. He's been attacked on his Facebook page a lot, and that people really try to counter activists' stories and the narrative and put out the government narrative and the propaganda of the regime on Facebook and on all those social media. They also have these fake Twitter accounts where they just try to flood social media with tweets of the government narrative, so that you, just because of the sheer amount of tweets, you cannot really follow the actual story that's out there.
And Instagram. I mean, that was one of the things that this isn't the Syrian government, particularly with Assad's wife. There's a lot of the Instagram photo, which I thought was an interesting.
They use all the social media tools that are available, and they're actually quite good at it. Fortunately, the other side is also getting better and better in defending itself against it. But so I would say social media definitely is, they try to use social media to fuel the conflict. But it's fortunately also not always successful.
Yeah, and I think figuring out the role of these tools in incitement to specific acts of violence, I think, is quite difficult, to be honest.
To trace it back to a specific tweet or
because,
something, this is very difficult.
You know, the studies that we're talking about, the one in Syria, spoke not only about people being incensed by the images, certainly the YouTube videos that they saw, but also a lot of them were recoiling from a lot of the violence that was being portrayed. So there's a sort of double dynamic, and I don't know which one leads to incitement. Now, in other parts of the world that we work, certainly we've been in places like Burma, where a lot of media professionals are extremely afraid about the power of social media, Facebook specifically, to incite violence, interethnic violence. Again, those causal roles are a bit difficult to sort of tie together, but certainly they create an atmosphere of fear.
I mean, there's so much violence in Syria already that it's really hard to trace back a certain incident to like one video in particular.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are cases where definitely they play a role. But rumors also in general play a role, whether they come through social media or like they're spread on the street. So if somebody just says this person was killed because he is an Alawite in this village, then it might have repercussions even without social media. And we saw that the tweets are actually not being followed so closely in the country itself, but that the attention is much bigger outside. So the external reaction to those tweets might be much bigger, and then of course then it's not a violent reaction.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
I guess the nature of the conflict in comparison in Iraq is different than the nature of conflict in Syria. I mean, and that's reflected on the Twitter sphere and in social media in general. In Syria, it is being played, I mean, online as a zero-sum game. So it's incitement of violence, etc., etc. In Iraq, it's a bit different. It's not, I mean, despite the fact that there is an armed resistance or rebellion or whatever you want to call it in Anbar, that has not been reflected on the social media as strongly as it has done in Syria. So it is more like another classic competition, if you like, that is using different tools this time. And the other factor is the government in Iraq is always playing catch-up. I mean, I don't think they've ever taken the social media seriously until 5 or 6 months ago, when we're noticing the number of, let's say, pro-government Facebook pages started going up. They started taking issues seriously. But again, I think so far the government in Iraq doesn't have a real strategy, unlike Syria, on dealing with social media and resistance on social media. So it's just a catch-up, and I personally believe that even when they started some activities a few months ago, it's only in preparation for the elections, and I actually think a few months down the line they will lose interest again.
Just one thing to add, the learning curve of the Syrian regime in terms of social media was really steep. I remember that when we started in Syria, Facebook was still banned. They didn't, and then they opened it because they thought it makes it easier for them to monitor people's activity and to follow who's actually doing what. And I still remember that we had journalists or activists coming to Beirut, and they told us that at the border they were asked, like, "Where's your Facebook?" As if this was like something you carry in your suitcase with you.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, those days are over.
That's great. Just a reminder that if you have questions, we want it to be kind of as interactive as possible. So at all points, you can send in a question. And Aubrey, who's in white, will be walking up and down the hall, as will, yeah, as will Carol. So again, so that we can keep the conversation going on. As questions filter in, I will, very selfishly continue to ask the questions on my mind as I throw my phone at Anand. One of the things that I think is very difficult, because, I'm on social media a lot. And in fact, my first trip into Benghazi before the fall of Gaddafi was entirely planned on Facebook. And, I think part of it was email was more difficult. The whole trip and everything and all the meetings and just, the airport, even the UN flight was all planned on Facebook. And I thought that was fascinating in terms of just not being able to reach anyone by phone or by email during that period. But one of the things that I consistently struggle with is how do you differentiate between what is being trained or being called citizen journalists and between the activists? I mean, let's forget the other, agendas, but just, sincere activism versus citizen journalism, and how do you, particularly when you're training people on the ground, how do you help them differentiate between the two?
I think you cannot differentiate. It's becoming harder and harder. We started out as a traditional journalism organization, so we always wanted those, I wouldn't say neutral, but at least objective journalists who take both sides into account. But in a conflict like Syria, it just doesn't work. You cannot have people who take both sides into consideration and you can still try that they tell a balanced and fair story, but the people who report on this conflict, they are part of the conflict, and we just have to accept this. There's no way around it. And we have many, many people in our trainings who would not distinguish between being a journalist or a citizen journalist and an activist. It's, I think you can tell them, try to use professional skills in your role as a citizen journalist and to include some stuff that you would not do as an activist, but you cannot tell him, now forget that you're an activist, forget that you go to demonstrations, that you have a cause when you are a citizen journalist. But I think I mentioned the consumer before. It's important that we as consumer of citizen journalism have in mind that the people who report to us are not just journalists, but that they're part of the conflict.
And I think this is fed into also with the dearth of any actual formally trained journalists or international correspondents, especially in Syria, those citizen journalists have then become the feeding tube into international media reports around Syria. So they've tapped into this group, and so I think that makes all of these discourses, especially in our media, a bit more difficult to follow because they're so tied to local political activism and the gray area between citizen journalism and activism.
Great. Mark, do you have anything to add?
I think Suzanne is 100% accurate, and it's not just in Syria or Iraq. I think we see this across the region, that the lines between citizen journalism and activism is extremely blurred, and I think the trend is going to continue down that line. And in fact, we have a problem convincing professionally trained journalists to remain objective. I mean, forget about citizen journalists.
Yeah, that's true.
So, unfortunately, I think that trend will continue.
But I think also in a way the discourse has become more honest through this phenomenon of citizen journalists, because before we as professional journalists, we always pretended to be objective, but of course we had our preferences, and we all come with baggage, and we have political opinions, and we try to hide them, but now it's more obvious that people who report on a conflict are not neutral.
Yeah, and I think that, both of you brought up a good point, and actually one of the questions that we have from Twitter from Casey is that, how does all of this affect traditional media? Particularly when you're talking about low internet penetration and the generation differences. Does this mean that we shift strategies, focus on social media? How do we integrate traditional media? How does this trend, and particularly the work that you were talking about, Anand, what is its impact on traditional media?
Well, in the case of USIP, we do traditional media programming in Afghanistan, we do traditional media programming in Iraq. All of them integrate social media. So I don't think we make a programmatic distinction. And increasingly, it doesn't make any sense to make that distinction because for example, we have a youth program in Iraq, Salam Shabab, that you're well acquainted with. It's now really that community lives online, and it was started perhaps by a TV show, but to make that distinction now doesn't really make much sense. And even in places like Afghanistan, where perhaps social media penetration isn't the highest due to perhaps literacy and infrastructure problems, mobile phones are then the point of engagement. And so making that distinction makes less and less sense from a programmatic standpoint.
Great.
Yeah, I think we really try to marry traditional journalism with the new social media. I mean, they're not so new anymore, actually, with social media and with multimedia reporting styles. And I think one key word here is transparency, that you make clear who is reporting on what. Like if we publish a story from a well-known human rights lawyer, for example, from Syria, we tell the people this is a human rights lawyer so that they know this person is somehow involved in the conflict, has her own perspective on this whole thing, and doesn't think that this is an expert, a neutral expert who looks on this from a bird's eye perspective or something. So I think transparency in the whole process is very important.
That's great.
Yeah, I think, the majority of traditional media, they have integrated social media into their operations in two ways, both as a publishing or outreach extension, if you like, and as a tip line. So making a distinction between social media and traditional journalism is no longer possible, really. It's part of the same pot and mixture, the same structure, really.
Great. And then we have one question from our audience, which talks about the role of social media and extremists, and how social media is helping extremism and what role social media played in mobilizing, and particularly the question of foreign fighters coming into Syria and other conflicts in the region. Suzanne, should we start with you since the question targets Syria?
Yeah, it's really hard for us to know whether the foreign fighters came to Syria because they follow Twitter. So they don't really tell you about their motivation, why they went to Syria. But I think it definitely, the problem with extremism is that it gets a lot of attention. So once you put extreme views out there, they get picked up, they get reported on. If you put a video that is showing how people negotiate, nobody will watch it. But if you put out a video where someone is decapitated, of course everybody watches it. So I think social media is it's a platform that is used a lot by extremists to get attention, and that, of course, is very dangerous.
Yeah, makes sense. Have you seen the same thing?
Yeah, I actually have doubts about the use of social media as a recruitment tool. I have serious doubt about that. I agree with Suzanne. I personally follow a lot of the jihadist chatter online, whether it's on forums or Twitter, and they have a very strong presence. But they use it mostly for communication and internal propaganda rather than as a recruitment tool. But specifically on Twitter, I don't know, the jihadists they have such a love relationship with Twitter particularly. They are all over the place, and they even fight their battles on Twitter.
I would actually like to add one point. The Syrian regime has been very successful in playing the extremism card.
Yeah.
From the very beginning of the revolution, they were stating that these are extremists or Islamists trying to create an Islamic state in Syria, and so this trend was fueled into the social media by them. They always stressed this part, and then it has become like a story of its own, and the international media picked it up, and everybody was focusing on these extremists rather than on the peaceful demonstrators and on all the civil society organizations who are still doing a lot of things on the ground. They're just not getting reported on because everybody wants to write a story about Al-Qaeda and Daesh and all these extremist groups because they're just more juicy. And I think in this case, the regime has used social media very successfully.
And I think you're right that the strategy of the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know really took traction in ways that it shifted a little bit of the public opinion on the Syrian opposition, not only in the U.S., but I think globally. Even in the region, you hear a fear of, do we want to do this? I got another question from the audience, which is almost the flip side of the question of extremists, but do you feel that there's a role that the U.S. government, particularly State Department, CIA, or other areas, are influencing either Iraq or Syria media? Is there, the other side of the influence and tools?
Well, it's interesting that the American assistance came in the form of communication tools, not in terms of weapons, right? I don't know to the extent that they're actually changing media discourse, but if we have any, if the graphs that I showed you tell us anything, is that if they are shifting it, if it's in English, it's perhaps not reaching the people who we think they're supposed to reach. And they're perhaps speaking to our own discourses and our own attitudes towards the conflict, if anything.
Oh, makes sense.
Yeah, I think your figures underlined this point. I was really interested in seeing that the Twitter discussion is now owned basically by the Arabic speakers. So even if they attempt to influence, they would have to do it in Arabic at least. It's very hard if they just put out an English tweet. But for example, the American embassy in Beirut, they post regularly on Facebook about Syria. And I know that these posts are being picked up by foreign journalists, but I don't think they have a lot of feedback into the country actually.
Yeah, that's great.
U.S. government funding has played a great role in developing Iraqi media in general, whether traditional media or social media. Millions of dollars was spent by mainly DRL on doing training and capacity building for both journalists and institutions. And I think that paid off. I mean, despite all the shortcomings of Iraqi journalism today, in many aspects, it's way ahead of the rest of the region, including the Arab Spring countries. And there is still ongoing support for maybe, if not traditional media, at least new media and social media activists. There are different youth groups, bloggers, social media activists that still receive, if not direct financial support, they receive a lot of political and mental support from the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. So there is a huge impact, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to draw a map on the accurate size of that impact because the information is so dispersed and people don't talk to each other. So, and specifically, if you mentioned CIA, I mean, how are we going to find out?
If we know they're not doing a good job,
exactly, Exactly.
Another question from the audience that I think is something that is a really good point in terms of do you feel social media has actually given a voice to some of the marginalized groups? Particularly, what strikes me, but it's not listed in this question, is youth. But in this question is like women, minorities. Has it opened a platform that previously might not have been accessible?
Well, in the Iraq experience, it definitely has. No question about it.
Can you give a few examples?
I mean, youth and women in particular, they are very active on using social media, and they are making their voices increasingly heard. Because as I said, most of the Iraqi media uses social media as a tip line as well. So there are a lot of events and issues that, if they weren't published on social media, the traditional media wouldn't have heard about it, and it wouldn't have been wouldn't get covered by the mainstream media. So social media definitely has played that role.
Yeah, I think that's a strong yes. I mean, that's true actually for all the Arab Spring countries. I remember talking to a Tunisian blogger in January 2011, and she said she was so frustrated that nobody would ever listen to her complaints, and she felt like they could not change anything. And then she did a YouTube video, and it was all of a sudden picked up by the mainstream media internationally, and then all of a sudden everybody was talking about Tunisia. So she really felt like she could reach out to the world and tell them about what was going on. So I think definitely yes.
That's great.
One thing to sort of think about here is, in our research around Syria, one thing we found was that it's not so much about minorities, but certain clusters of Twitter users began to cluster more together. How do I explain that? So English-speaking journalists, for example, became a cluster. Certain political groups or religious groups became a cluster, and they talked less and less to each other. So the beginning of our study, a lot of their discourse was embedded in the larger Arab Spring discourse. They were tweeting, retweeting messages from other parts of the region. But as the conflict progressed, they were becoming more and more insular, talking more and more to themselves, and really not across groups, across regions, certainly across countries and languages. So that is something to keep in mind. So while minority groups or small groups might have more of a voice, their audience is perhaps narrowing. That might actually point perhaps to a greater influence, ironically speaking. Because if you are an English-speaking journalist, or you are a local citizen journalist who can tweet in English, you might have a greater influence because the community that you're speaking to is far more concentrated and is paying attention to a much smaller set of, much smaller discourse. But it is still a small discourse.
But that's very interesting. I think this just underlines that even social media also follows just general human behavior, because I think also in the real world, in traditional media, people tend to read the newspaper that underlines their own point of view.
Yeah.
So within social media, you always talk to the people who confirm what you're thinking already, and not necessarily have the opposite view.
And it might also provide another option for people, and particularly I'm thinking of minorities, to be able to organize and have their own platform to then strategize in terms of larger communities. There's a question from Karen Volker from Cure Violence, and it says that there's a deep concern about the potential for retaliation, either now or at the end of the conflict, and what is being done or could be done to mitigate the risk of retaliation. For example, setting expectations and norms about the acceptability of doing retaliation after.
Through social media or?
Through social media.
Well, it's a tough question because I think the conflict is just still so heated and going on that I think I'm definitely sure that there will be thirst for retaliation in many places because so much blood has been spilled. I think in the past we could see that traditional media tries to take this role and they try to do peace building, they try to bring people together again, they try to refrain from inciting violence, but in social media, because you don't have one central place from where it's controlled, it's really hard to utilize it, I think, for this purpose. Because it's really hard to counter. If somebody goes out there and wants to ask for retaliation, how do you stop them? You can just counter the message, but it's really hard you cannot stop it.
Yeah. And maybe that's a little bit of it is the campaigning beforehand to prepare the ground for transitional justice or whatever would need to happen to avoid retaliation. But in terms of direct action, I think you're right. Amar, do you have anything to add?
I agree. I mean, it's very nice that you mentioned transitional justice. A few days ago, I was having a Twitter conversation with a Syrian activist from Hama. And it started with opinion about the Nusra Front, and he was defending them. And then I started talking to him about principles of transitional justice and should be based on the individual conduct rather than so on. And 25 minutes into the discussion, he was convinced. I mean, he started off defending Nusra Front. 25 minutes later, he was convinced that the best thing was actually transitional justice because then the country would be safeguarded. So I think preparation from now on the issue of transitional justice, which IWPR, by the way, has done in Syria. We've produced a manual on that issue. But taking that a step further, pushing the message through to all involved parties that this is, once the conflict subsides, that's the path that should be taken. It's very important. It's very important to prepare for that from now using both the traditional and social media.
Okay. I have a question from Casey with Search for Common Ground. Are these strategies specific to media that can be leveraged to bridge divides? And I think she says that we've talked specifically about social media and incitement, but how can we use it to bring people together? I know that you've touched on it a little bit, but maybe giving some examples where that's been used or demonstrated.
Do you have any examples?
Not really. I mean, in Iraq, as I said, the use of social media is very limited. So I haven't seen personally in Iraq an attempt to use social media to bring people together. Maybe to start a discussion, yes, and to continue a discussion at a limited level. Because as you said exactly, there are certain communities and clusters that keep getting narrower. So I haven't seen any attempt at achieving what you just asked at a larger scale.
There are, I mean, in somewhat more hearteningly, I think, there are attempts at a higher level to talk about Exchange 2.0, which is something we've talked about a lot here at the Institute, but that really refers to using online tools as a way to bring students together, perhaps to complement or replace in cases where it's difficult to manage logistically physical exchanges between students. And the State Department has really taken this up. There are a couple of organizations like Solia who have been really pioneering in this field, using online tools to make conversations between the West and the Muslim world, is the way they put it. But what's key to the way they do this is that it's all very much curriculum driven. So these are willing participants, sometimes less willing, but certainly people who are coming to the table and then being walked through these interactions with people with whom they might not have had any chance to interact. Of course, this is happening at a much higher scale. Like I said, it's between the Muslim world and Americans and people from other parts of Europe, perhaps. But maybe there's a model there, but it's quite heavily managed.
I mean, and to kind of build on Casey's question, one of the things that I've seen happen within a lot of conflicts, and I'm thinking specifically of the Libya conflict, was the role of the diaspora. And, you know, particularly Libyans in Europe and the US really having very strong opinions, but then people inside Libya feeling disconnected from some of the recommendations that were being made. And it almost created a new form of conflict between the diaspora, between people in country. And that took form both in an unhealthy way, but then began more towards a healthy way of building bridges between the two communities through social media, because that was really the only way that the two groups could interact. Have you seen anything like that emerge in other conflicts where you're seeing social media playing a role, or, you know, whether positive or negative, but particularly the role of the diaspora in interacting with people in country?
Definitely in the case of Syria. I mean, the Syrian diaspora has been using social media a lot, and a lot of the Facebook pages that got really a large number of followers were from the diaspora. I mean, also obviously because journalists rather follow an English website than a Facebook page than an Arabic Facebook page, so language plays an important role. But it also has created this controversy because the people inside on the ground, they say it's easy for you to talk, and we're the ones who are fighting on the ground, and we're the ones who take all the hits. So, but I think also it has changed a little bit, and they feel that they have to be in this together, that they have to cooperate in order to find a solution, that it cannot be done neither by the people outside or by the people inside alone, that they have to come together.
Right.
Well, I guess in Iraq it's a bit different. I mean, diaspora doesn't have much say in events in Iraq or politics because the system is open. I mean, you have elections, you have freedom of movement. It's more or less a normal country, more or less. So the diaspora doesn't have much influence on whether on opinions or on events on the ground, and no one takes them seriously anyway.
That's interesting, Ammar. I'm going to push you a little bit on that, because one of the threads that continues to emerge, actually in both conflicts, is the sectarianism. And and Stimson Center was actually studying a lot of the tweets and a lot of the social media sites and tying them to actual events on the ground. And as you guys already said, it's very hard to prove any causality, but there was an interesting correlation between them. And I think that, you know, just be specifically on sectarianism in the diaspora, there tends to be very strong language used in social media one way or the other.
I mean, in the Iraqi context, my reading is that it's always initiated from the inside. I don't see initiation from the diaspora. From the diaspora, it's mostly reactions to what's already being done, published and disseminated from inside the country. And one of the reasons why they don't have so much influence is because they don't have information. I mean, if we look at sectarian activism or promotion or propaganda for Iraq, it's mostly Facebook. I mean, we can't easily discount Twitter. The majority of that work is done by individuals who are placed at the places of action. I mean, it's not even nationwide. So, and they have information, they provide figures, pictures, etc., etc. So whatever comes from abroad, from the diaspora, is merely a reaction, and it doesn't have the influence that you think on events inside the country.
That's a really good point, I think, particularly about like access to information and the legitimacy of what's coming out.
Absolutely.
I think that's a really good point.
I think it's slightly different in the case of Syria. I think, again, here the regime plays a rather dark role. I mean, they really have been trying to use social media to fuel sectarianism by spreading false stories about attacks on Christians, by spreading false news of attacks on any minority inside the country. But I don't really know, or it's really hard to measure what kind of repercussion this has inside the country. I know that it gets the attention of the media, of the international media a lot, and that this then it plays in the favor of the regime, that they think, oh, they're there to protect the Christians, they're there to protect the minorities. But I don't know if anybody actually goes and kills someone because of a story that was posted online. Or I think the sectarianism is obviously there, but I think it's there without social media also.
And I think you're unfortunately probably right. The next question is from Tara from the Iraq Foundation. And the question is, can the panelists comment on use of information communication technology tools for secure exchange of information to protect journalists? It's a big issue, I think, with impunity for crimes against journalists, and especially focusing in on Iraq.
Well, IWPR has a I would say, serious information security and internet security program. It's a regional program, so participants from all over the region are allowed to participate, including Iraq. However, as I mentioned earlier, I think the Iraqi government's tools on censoring and monitoring digital technology, whether it's the internet or mobile phones or phones at large, are limited in comparison to the capacity of neighboring regimes. So although it is a threat, it is still not a big threat as we would think. However, I think that down the line, maybe a year or even less, Iraq will probably be catching up and increasing its capacity on monitoring and of not only journalists but political opponents in general. So I think in the next year or two, digital security issues must be taken seriously in Iraq in particular.
We at IWR take communication and information security very seriously. We have a program that's called Cyber Arabs, I just mentioned it, and it trains activists and journalists, human rights defenders in digital security in order to enable them to communicate securely online. Usually it's a 5-day training where they learn about how to encrypt their files, how to communicate securely on email, how to hide data files on their computers, and we have had many Syrians, for example, in these trainings, especially from the government-controlled areas where they still have to communicate through the government infrastructure on IT. And it's really important because now, as I said before, they were not so savvy and they asked, where's your Facebook? But now they know what to look for. And we had a case of an activist that we trained who came to a checkpoint and they seized his computer and his mobile phone and they knew what to look for. But fortunately, he had learned how to hide those files very well and they didn't find anything, so he could pass through. So it can save lives to know how to protect yourself.
And more broadly speaking, I think one of the, positive outcomes of a lot of the revelations about NSA, for example, has been that the awareness across the board has increased about the need for this security, and also the technology companies themselves have been become quite vested in making sure that these that they're not branded as being part of a government surveillance operation, for example. Coincidentally, I don't think these two things are tied together, but Google Ideas, who is Google's think tank, who's been working quite a bit on activist security, around the same time released a number of tools for encryption, for anonymization, and so I think, broadly speaking, these tools are becoming quite a bit more prevalent. They're not just in the margins of sort of tech geek communities. This is sort of coming out into the mainstream, and people's awareness more broadly is increasing.
I mean, that's absolutely fascinating because I haven't heard of any type of training, and one of the first things I want to do is actually find a way to take that training because I know it's my biggest fear going into countries. If someone picks up my phone, not only am I in trouble, a lot of people I work with are in trouble. There's a question from Twitter, and it brings up, I think, a really good point that I've seen kind of debated online quite a bit, which he refers to as Slacktivism, when social media starts replacing, particularly for Western audiences, starts replacing like real live protests or activism. So and I think that, you see this quite a lot, people saying, don't just press like, do something. So be interested to see kind of what is the impression in terms of if that's true, and also are there ways to counter that where you're also having a social media but a live active movement as well?
I think it's very true, but it's very easy to judge. I mean, if you live outside Syria and you follow the events on Facebook, the only thing you can do is press the like button, or maybe you donate somewhere or so. But we in Beirut, we've had the experience that we train people in certain capacities, and then they don't really put them into action because they're so busy following everything on Facebook. This is sometimes really frustrating. And you can see that they posted something at 3 a.m. in the morning, and then the next day you ask them if they fulfilled their assignment, say, no, I was too busy. And you say, yeah, okay, you were too busy on Facebook. And I think it's really easy to confuse being active on Facebook with really being active on the ground. And but on the other hand, it is a great communication tool. People can network on Facebook. They can put the message out there. So I wouldn't condemn it in total, but you have to put it to use in a good way.
And I think we should not dismiss Slacktivism quite as much. a couple of years ago, Malcolm Gladwell wrote the sort of seminal, or at least argument-starting piece on this, which was "The Revolution Will Not Be Tweeted," where he dismissed Slacktivism as being, or internet-based activism as being Slacktivism and not really having any roots in proper organizations and the kind of infrastructure you need to make the kind of change that happened perhaps in the 1960s during the civil rights era. Zeynep Tufekci, who is a researcher at, I think she's University of North Carolina, has been talking quite a bit, we've had her here at the Institute, talking quite a bit about how the role of sort of these loose ties, as he calls it, in building the base of support that all of these infrastructures can then draw upon in order to create the kind of change that's necessary. So Slacktivism is not something not to be dismissed completely, I think. It has a role in creating the foundations for large-scale change, though the need for more formal infrastructure is probably still there.
Well, you just mentioned that you planned your entire trip to Libya on Facebook, so there is a practical use, of course, for it. So, but
Yeah, definitely. So one more question, and we're actually going to go back to the question about kind of credibility. This is a question from Mohammed Abdullah in terms of, we're all saying that there's a difficulty to vet the information coming from social media, and that, the question says that there's a lot of false, wrong, misleading news on the web. In addition to the question of the role of the media, the consumer, but, is there a threat or a fear that bringing social media, this type of thing will actually start to lose all credibility for social media?
you want to go first?
Sure, I mean, I think the main, Mohammed knows a lot about this, so it's a bit of a leading question. We've had him on a panel it's a tough one. We've had him on a panel to answer just this question. He couldn't answer it, so now he's putting it back to us. No, I'm joking, but
Revenge, beautiful.
Yeah. But I think the main fear comes from the lack of editorial structures, right? So we used to trust editorial structures in the formal news sector, if you want to call it that, and those structures just don't exist in the Twitter sphere or the social media sphere. So in response, I think we've seen, certainly in the case of Syria, a lot of informal but still structures emerge. The role of curators has been touted quite a bit. For example, in the Western media, Andy Carvin, Sultan Al-Qasemi have really made sense of a very confusing Twitter discussion, certainly around Syria, and said, okay, here are people you can trust, here are tweets you can trust. And Andy Carvin, for example, they've used Twitter not only to take information in, but then use Twitter to verify the information. So the role of these quasi-editorial structures is still quite important. So we might not have the formal structures of a newspaper, but these curators sort of acting as online editors for us as external consumers. And I think that human element, that structural element just won't go away. They will emerge sooner or later, I think.
I would say the risk is now lower than in the beginning of social media days, because people have learned. They have learned that they cannot just blindly trust any video that's being put up there or any tweet that's being put. Now they look who put up this tweet, who is this person, where is he or she based, and then you have those curated lists of people that they know we can trust this person, and this person, and then you use Twitter as a verification tool, and also the traditional media has reacted to it by actually establishing verification departments within this editorial structure that use certain techniques. They try to look at the pictures that are being tweeted. Is it consistent with the weather at this time? Is it the landscape that you see? Is it really Syria, or is it maybe Lebanon, or the uniform that somebody wears? Is it the type of uniform that they really wear? So there's many verification tools by now that can actually help you to identify fake videos rather quickly.
Oh, that's great. That's good to know. Ammar?
Yeah, I think the users of social media learn very quickly, and they are very savvy. So it's no longer very easy as like 6 or 7 years ago to just post anything online and people just take it at face value. It happens, but it's not as badly as you would think.
Wow. Well, great. Well, thank you very much. Before I close, I just want to turn to you if there's anything that you want to add or, discuss amongst yourself, or anything that you haven't had a chance that you feel is very important to share. I want to make sure to provide you that, not in the form of a question, but in form of any final comments.
Can I take my prerogative as a panelist to ask them a question?
Yeah, of course you can.
I've been curious. I know that attacks, especially in Iraq, and certainly in Syria, I'm sure, attacks on journalists have been an increasing concern, certainly for IWPR. Have you seen similar levels of attacks? Do you study the attacks on citizen journalists? Is it something that worries you, or is there some way that you try to address it? Or
in Iraq in particular, I'll be very specific. In Kurdistan, the pressure on journalists is definitely higher than the rest of the country.
Okay.
The political system is fairly stable, and they don't take a position in a good way. So there is definitely a focus on let's say, limiting the freedoms of journalists, whether professional journalists or citizen journalists. In the rest of Iraq, it goes up and down in direct correlation with the events. When the security is bad, obviously there are sort of increased number of attacks on journalists, on citizen journalists or activists alike. When the security situation is fairly stable, then number of attacks and intimidations and harassment of journalists go down. So far, I mean, I don't believe there is a systematic planned campaign or intention to harass and limit journalists. However, the existing legal framework allows both impunity and allows any party, not only government really, to take on media, whether physical harassment or lawsuits, to take on media and citizen journalists. And that needs fixing. And this is one of the things that we are working on, for example.
Great.
Well, in Syria, citizen journalists are definitely being targeted as well. And the problem is that they're not only being targeted by one side, by the regime, but that they're also being targeted by the other, by the extremists, by Daesh, and by all those other groups, and really face a large number of risks. And actually, the number of journalists, of citizen journalists being killed, is almost higher than the number of traditional journalists being killed.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you all. Thank you for the very important work that you're doing and for shedding light on this topic. And thank you for coming to USIP and being with us today and all your questions. Thank you.